Just a gentle reminder, your fourth and final quiz is the end of this week. And probably early next week, I'll send out an announcement on the final, what the areas are going to be covered, things like that. So. Now, as I pointed out on Friday, Kennedy had tried working with the Southern governors when it came to the civil rights, but he'd become increasingly frustrated. And on June 11th, 1963, Kennedy goes on television to make a major address. He proposes new civil rights legislation, which would ban segregation and protect voting rights. And Kennedy was a rather eloquent speaker. These are just a few excerpts from the speech. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Now, those are ringing words on civil rights, but you notice something about it? Because his skin is dark, because he, get it? Yeah. It's very gender specific, isn't it? Male oriented. And I point that out to show you it's a different day and age. Even people fighting for equal rights don't even think about gender rights. Now, almost to tragically drive Kennedy's point home, that night, the leader of the NAACP in Mississippi, Medgar Evers, was assassinated, was murdered in his own driveway. He was a Korean veteran, he was a family man, a hard worker, and was gunned down. And by the way, they caught the guy who did it, Byron D. LeBeckwith. He left the gun behind with his fingerprints on it, and an all-white jury in Mississippi declined to convict him. It would be a few decades later before the federal government would prosecute him on civil rights charges. But basically, it shows you back then, if you're a white racist, you can get by with murder in a place like Mississippi or Alabama. Now, the speech has a profound effect on the leaders of the civil rights movement. They had been planning a march on Washington, and it would also include direct action. The focus was to be on jobs. Good morning. Good morning. But after Kennedy's speech, they decided to turn the march into a rally in support of Kennedy's civil rights legislation. So they took out a lot of the civil disobedience they had planned and also toned down their criticism of the Kennedy administration. Kennedy does something previous presidents largely declined to do. On the eve of the march, he invited all the leaders to the White House and an official photograph taken, things like that. Kennedy publicly endorses the March on Washington, something previous presidents had usually didn't do. So the Kennedy administration cooperates with the marchers. Now, the march is held in early August. The opening ceremonies, Marian Anderson sings the Star-Spangled Banner. You remember who she was? I've talked about her before. Who was Marian Anderson? She was the African-American opera singer that gave the speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter 1939, remember? Now she's singing the national anthem at the beginning of the March on Washington. Runs from it's on the 28th of August. Over 250,000 people packed Washington for the march. Several civil rights activists, such as John Lewis, Floyd McKissick, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, all gave speeches. And again, to kind of highlight the fact that the movement may have been for equal rights for all races, but kind of neglected women, there's no prominent civil rights activist, no woman civil rights activist invited to give a speech. Not Rosa Parks, not Ella Baker, who had the SCLC, not Diane Nash, who was a major player in places like Nashville and all that. So it's kind of a male-dominated affair, folks. A Jewish rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant minister all lead the marchers in prayer. And the highlight is a historic speech given by Dr. King. He says the nation had given African Americans a check mark insufficient funds when it came to civil rights. And he pleaded for an egalitarian America where everyone was equal. And again, it's one of the great speeches in all history. There's Dr. King addressing the crowd. By the way, here's what it looked like to him. These are a few excerpts from the speech. It's about 20, 25 minutes long. It's not that long of a speech, and you can get it on YouTube, and I urge you to watch it. But it transcends the civil rights movement. It's a universal call for treating everyone equally, everyone the same. And he ends basically by saying that he has a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Unfortunately, the march and Dr. King's rousing speech don't have the impact that he and the Kennedy administration hoped. Here's some of the people at the march. By the way, if you notice, It's a biracial crowd. And naturally, there were celebrities there. Joan Baez and an extremely young Bob Dylan. You guys have heard of Bob Dylan, haven't you? Have you heard of Joan Baez? Yeah, she was rather popular back then. Not like Dylan, though. And there were several major movie stars and writers. There's Marlon Brando posing with the author of James Baldwin. Those are some big name stars: Charlton Heston, Sidney Poitier, Sammy Davis Jr., Paul Newman. Have you heard of any of those? Like I said, the march, however, doesn't have the impact that Kennedy and the others had hoped. If anything, it leads to a racist backlash. Congress holds heated debates on Kennedy's proposed civil rights legislation. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, testifies 10 different times in front of congressional committees in behalf of the legislation. But it fails to pass Congress. Kennedy fails to get it done. And as I pointed out, it leads to a backlash. Less than a month later, on the 15th of September, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham is bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. 4 little girls were killed. They were at choir practice. They were aged 10 to 14. And again, they figured out who did it, but being white Klansmen, they were not prosecuted in Alabama. And that November, numerous pro-segregation candidates win election in the congressional races. Now, even though it provokes a backlash, it does lead to an important change. Beginning with Kennedy, the executive branch, the presidency, is going to be highly supportive of civil rights. What Kennedy isn't able to accomplish is civil rights legislation. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, will be able to get through Congress. And Johnson will turn out, ironically, to be an ardent supporter of the civil rights movement. Now, at the same time, Kennedy is trying to get the civil rights legislation through Congress. He's also dealing with another major issue. What do we do with the American-backed dictator of South Vietnam? And since I'm going to be talking about Vietnam for the next couple of days, I thought I'd bring a few. Well, today I brought this in, but I thought I'd show you a little bit about Vietnamese culture. You see what's in this? It's a scorpion. This is Vietnamese health elixir. You actually drink this. It's got a big scorpion in it. It's got some roots and stuff like that, herbs, and it's in a rice wine. But this is typical over there. You can find either ones with big scorpions in them or snakes. They have them with cobras too. I'll pass this around if you want to look at it. Anybody want to try it? I asked my driver and interpreter when I was over there. I said, "Do you really drink this stuff?" And he goes, His name was Ho. I said, Ho, do you really drink this stuff? He goes, yes, good for you. Then he goes, smiles and goes, it's like Viagra. No, can't be. But next couple of days, I'll be bringing stuff like that. No more bottles of that. Viet Cong rifle and some other things. Oh, hell no. It really doesn't hurt you. A lot of people do drink it over there.
Wine, kill.
Yeah, it's basically in rice wine, and the herbs are good for you. You know, I don't know if the scorpion hurt you.
Right.
It's not the big scorpions you got to worry about over there. It's the little ones, yeah. Those are the ones that will kill you. You can go into little shops there and there'll be, rows of those things for sale. And notice they're all reused bottles. It's all bottled locally. Now, if you recall, during the Eisenhower administration, the French had been trying to hang on to Vietnam, but they lost their war. And in 1954, during the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was temporarily divided in half. The victorious communists under Ho Chi Minh were awarded the northern half of the country, and a pro-French faction was awarded the southern half. This was supposed to be temporary. Within 2 years, they were supposed to hold elections to reunite Vietnam. Now, the so-called Republic of South Vietnam had an extremely weak leader at that time. The so-called Playboy Emperor, Bao Dai. There was no way somebody like him could create a viable state, turn South Vietnam into a working nation. He was far too interested in drinking, womanizing, and gambling, particularly on the French Riviera. He didn't even particularly like speaking Vietnamese, he spoke fluent French. So the Americans decided he needed a strong man, somebody that could actually run the government, a prime minister that was competent. So where are you going to look for a would-be leader for South Vietnam? Catholic monastery in New Jersey, of course. First place you look, isn't it? Strangely enough, that's where they found one. No Dinh Diem. D's in Vietnamese can either have a hard sound or sound more like a J. So his name's pronounced No Dinh Diem. Actually, Diem was a Vietnamese politician and had gone into exile because he couldn't work with either government. But after the Geneva Accords, he wanted to go back home. And with the cooperation of the United States, we set him up as the Prime Minister of South Vietnam. Bao Dai was the president, quote unquote, and Diem was the real source of power, the Prime Minister. Now, when Diem arrived back in Vietnam, it was chaotic. It had been destabilized by World War II, the Franco-Vietnam War, you name it. no one was actually in control. He had several groups he had to contend with. One was the Benzoian. They were basically a criminal organization. They had their own army. They controlled all the gambling and prostitution in Saigon. He also had to deal with two powerful religious sects. Cao Dai and the Ho Hao. They were basically offshoots of Buddhism, and they both exist in Vietnam today, by the way. Both have over 1 million adherents in Vietnam. But they're basically an offshoot of Buddhism. Cao Dai also includes aspects of Christianity. But again, during World War II, they had built up their own militia, and by the early 1950s, they had their own armies. The Cao Dai had an army of 50,000 men, and they didn't want to submit to government control. On top of that, there was the Black Flag, who were river pirates, and other groups. So if Diem was actually going to become a viable prime minister of Vietnam, he had to crush all these groups. And in 1955, he goes to war with them, with American backing. And much of Saigon's leveled, but he routs them. They're defeated, but not destroyed. Remnants of all three seek refuge in the Mekong Delta. This is the delta down here. It's jungle, it's swamp. You can easily hide down here. And trust me, easily get lost. There were also former Viet Minh still in the South. Under the Geneva Accords, they were allowed to remain in the South if they wanted to, as long as they didn't engage in any military activity or anything. So they remained behind, planning for the elections in 1956. When Diem went after these organizations, he also went after the Viet Minh. So you've got all these groups that have sort of been defeated, but they're not destroyed, and they want revenge. Here's No Ninh Diem. But his win in Saigon, his routing of these organizations, convinced the Eisenhower administration to support him. And after that, they decided that he was going to be our man in Southeast Asia. We had to get rid of Bao Dai. He was a nuisance. So we rigged an election. Diem runs against Bao Dai for president, and with the help of the CIA, Diem wins overwhelmingly. We got over 540,000 votes in Saigon when there were only 400,000 registered voters. That's the CIA for you. So we helped Diem consolidate his control in Vietnam. By the way, here's give you some idea of the fighting that occurred for him to consolidate his control. Here's troops loyal to Ziem, fighting Benzoin militia for control. That came out of Life magazine, by the way, as did this one. Now, he had consolidated his power by 1956. And with American acquiescence, Ziem refuses to hold the elections to reunify Vietnam. So he basically reneges on the Geneva Accords. And far from being a democratically elected president, Ziem is a dictator. He's autocratic. He doesn't really understand the average Vietnamese. To begin with, like many of the Vietnamese upper class, he was educated, was raised at a time when the French still controlled Vietnam. So he had a French education, spoke French fluently, along with Vietnamese. He really didn't understand the needs of the average Vietnamese peasant. Diem had come out of a Mandarin family, upper class. He really didn't know what it was like to work in a rice field or anything like that. And secondly, he was also Catholic, a religion introduced by the French. Only 10% of the population in Vietnam, and those tended to be the middle and upper classes, tended to be Catholic. What was the other 90% of the population? Huh? Yeah, they're Buddhist. Thank you. Yeah, 90% of the population is Buddhist. But the dictator is Catholic. He didn't like Buddhists. He looked down on them, thought they were, quote, backward. And being both extremely cautious and extremely paranoid, Vietnamese politics were rather deadly at times. He didn't trust that many people and tended to surround himself either with family members. His brother Nhu was the head of the secret police, for example. One of his older brothers was the Catholic Archbishop of Vietnam. So he surrounded himself either with family members or with fellow Catholics. Loyalty was paramount to Ziem. Not efficiency, not honesty. So the government of South Vietnam tended to be rather corrupt and rather inefficient. Here's Ngo Dinh Nhu, his brother. By the way, in Vietnamese, like in a lot of Southeast Asian cultures, what we consider to be the last name is actually the first name. So that's the family name, Ngo. And then what we would consider to be his first name would be Nhu. And here's his wife, Madame Nhu. Very beautiful, very charismatic, very evil. The Vietnamese people called her the Dragon Lady, and for good reason. Tell it's the 50s, right? The hairstyle and all that. And here's Eisenhower and Wallace greeting Ngo Dinh Diem. And to give you an idea how much we built him up, it was the Wonder Man of Southeast Asia. Well, as I pointed out, he was somewhat of a dictator, somewhat oppressive, but the United States is going to fully back him. He's our guy. Vietnam will receive the largest share of American foreign aid in the 1950s. We will do everything to try and boost their economy. We create a program known as the Commodities Import Program. And to avoid all the lengthy math, I'll give you the shorthand version. We're basically paying South Vietnamese businessmen to import American goods. The idea was to slowly inflate the economy, slowly increase the economy. What we really discovered was how corrupt everybody was. Far from helping the average Vietnamese, the Commodities Import Program led to rampant inflation and a ton of corruption. We were just learning what we were dealing with, quite frankly. The U.S. mission headquartered in Saigon was the largest in the world. There were over 1,500 Americans from the CIA to the Agriculture Department over there advising ZM and trying to help him in what we termed nation building. A lot of our support, however, was military. In 1956, the United States took over all responsibility for training and arming the South Vietnamese Army. By the way, their army was officially known as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So everybody called him Arvin. So when I refer to Arvin, that's the South Vietnamese Army. By the way, the Americans could not resist a good rhyme, so they called the average Vietnamese soldier Marvin. Marvin the Arvin. Which confused the hell out of them, because I have never in my life met a Vietnamese named Marvin. But it used to, I had no idea what we were talking about. So we take over responsibility for training them. I told you about ZM and New being autocratic, using torture, things like that to enforce their rule. Hey, you guys can't see this too well, but this is a prison cell in the main prison in Saigon. I've actually been in that. No, I wasn't imprisoned. I didn't do anything. I don't want to get in jail over there. Trust me. But it's about the size of a closet. It's basically nothing but cement. And during the daytime, it can get up to over 100 degrees in that thing. And during the winter monsoon, when it can get down to like 50 or 60 degrees, that thing will be awfully cold. Here's something else they used to keep prisoners in. It's known as a tiger cage. You wouldn't keep a tiger in this. Can you see what that's made out of? That's made out of barbed wire. That's barely big enough for a human being. And no, I didn't get stuffed in that, but luckily, but I would barely fit in that. Can you imagine trying, either way you move, you're gonna rip the hell out of yourself with that barbed wire. And they also had other torture devices and all that. But Ziem ran a very repressive regime. By the way, here's where the American advisors lived initially in the 1950s.
Was that one of the French prison?
No, that's a French villa.
Well, no, before. The French built the.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they used to title tables when Zien's government became famous for. But yeah, a lot of that dates back to the French. They also had a guillotine there that Zien used to use for executing people. And that's French.
What were the techniques?
Some were French, some were Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were very good at it in a long history. And you combine French and the Vietnamese, and it was ruthless. Extremely ruthless. Now, remember all those groups that have been defeated but not destroyed? In the late 1950s, they began to organize together to fight back against Ziem's regime. And they were joined by the Viet Minh. Now, the northern government, the communist government in the north, didn't want the Viet Minh in the south rising up. They were still committed to try and find a peaceful way to unite Vietnam. Plus, they were having their own problems in the north. So they really wanted to keep things quiet in the south, but it ain't going to work out that way. They start fighting back against the southern government. They establish a base of operations in the Mekong Delta and begin to take over villages. Ziem reacts again with a lot of violence and repression, and the Viet Minh decide that regardless of what the North wants, they're going to rebel. So they begin a campaign of assassination. They start killing village leaders, government officials, people like that. And by 1959, this new insurgency is beginning to pick up speed. As this is happening, the number of Americans in South Vietnam are growing, and we're beginning to take casualties. On June 8th, 1956, Sergeant Richard B. Fitzgibbon is killed in Vietnam. He will become the first name chronologically on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. Ironically, Fitzgibbon wasn't killed by the Viet Minh. He was murdered by another American. But he's officially the first name on the wall. A year later, in 1957, Captain Harry Griffith Kramer was killed by the Viet Minh during an attack at Nha Trang. And in 1959, Major Dale R. Buse and Master Sergeant Charles Avenand are both killed at Ben Hoa. They were in the mess hall watching a movie. You always would think, they're in a war zone, they'd be watching a John Wayne movie or something. They were watching a drama. It was The Tattered Dress starring Jean Crane. Just didn't seem like what kind of movie they'd be watching in a war zone. These are the first Americans killed in Vietnam, directly related to our involvement. Here's some advisors. My late father-in-law was an advisor in Vietnam in this era. He was over there in 1962. And here's the first guy killed in Vietnam, first guy listed on the wall. And until he was added later, Major Buse and Master Sergeant Obnan were the first two listed. And typical of the Army, they didn't even get his name right. It was originally listed as Avnord, so somebody pointed out they had the wrong name on there. Now, despite the growing success of the rebellion, the insurgents were basically organized and lacked focus. There was only one thing that really united all of them. They all hated Diem, and they all wanted to see him overthrown. Now, since the Viet Minh had risen up against the express orders of the North, the leadership of North Vietnam decided if there's going to be a rebellion, they're going to control it. So in December of 1960, they held a series of meetings with all the various revolutionary groups, and together they formed an umbrella organization for fighting Diem's government. It was known as the National Liberation Front, the NLF, not to be confused with the NFL. The National Liberation Front. It's a coalition of all the groups trying to overthrow Diem. But they are largely led and dominated by the former Viet Minh, the communists. So the National Liberation Front, most of its fighters, they call themselves the People's Liberation Armed Forces. Most of these guys are not communist, but most of the leadership is. They don't take direct orders from the North, but they do work in conjunction with the North Vietnamese. Now, Diem wanted to make it look like they were all communist. So he labeled them Vietnam Cong Sang, which means Viet Communist. And the shorthand for that became Viet Cong. That's what we will call our enemy in Vietnam. Keep in mind, they don't call themselves that. They're members of either the People's Liberation Armed Forces or they call themselves a militia. I've been over there, I've interviewed former Viet Cong. And strangely enough, they were quite friendly. But I never, ever called them Viet Cong. If I wanted the interview to end right then and there, so I always referred to them as militia or People's Liberation Army fighters. So keep that in mind. The term Viet Cong is a Western term for them. But at any rate, the rebellion is now organized, now led by the communists, and the ultimate goal is, one, to overthrow Diem, but secondly, reunite Vietnam. And here's the National Liberation Front flag. And here's some Viet Cong soldiers. And one of the reasons we had so much trouble telling who was friend and who was enemy, those black pajamas he's wearing, that's not a military uniform. That's what the average Vietnamese farmer wears. It's known as an ao ba ba. And it's basically, in Vietnamese, it means work clothes. Be the equivalent of wearing jeans or overalls over here. If you go to Vietnam today and you look out in the rice fields, people wear the same thing today. So how do you know who your enemy is? When your enemy dresses just like everybody else, right? Well, he's carrying a gun, that's a big hint. But aside from that, he's dressed just like your typical Vietnamese peasant. So it's very difficult at times to tell who your friend or who your enemy is. Yeah, this guy's part of a display in the Cu Chi tunnels outside of Saigon. Those tunnels are extremely small and narrow, by the way. And the Viet Minh were not all men. There were a lot of women that served in the National Liberation Front. I also want to point out most of them served in support roles, but there were some frontline fighters, women fighters. Now, Kennedy inherits this situation in Vietnam. Remember, when he inherits it, it's not really a crisis. It's an ongoing problem, but it's considered manageable at that point. Much like his predecessors, he doesn't quite know what to do about it. So he does more of the same. More support for Diem, more military assistance, more American advisors. He re-equips ARVN with brand new American equipment, for example. He increases the number of American advisors. When he takes office, there's about 3,200 American advisors in Vietnam. By the way, under the Geneva Accords, we're only supposed to have 300. He slowly increases the number of military personnel. By December of 1963, there will be 16,500 Americans in Vietnam. Almost all of those are military personnel now. In fact, they activate, and this is a sign of the huge military presence. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. And that will be the organization that runs the war in Vietnam. As we increase the number of Americans over there, and Kennedy doesn't just send advisors, he sends 2 companies of American helicopters over there. He sends ground support personnel, technicians. So we're doing more than just advising at this point. But the increasing number of Americans means increasing casualties. In 1962, 109 Americans are killed or wounded in Vietnam. 1963, 489 Americans are killed or wounded. We're getting increasingly frustrated with the incompetence and the corruption in both the South Vietnamese government and in the army. As much as we try and help and train them, the leadership is rather incompetent. Remember, they're there because they owe loyalty to Diem and not because they're good at their job. Now, the American advisors were all handpicked. You had to be recommended for the job. You had to go through the language school out in California. You had to learn counterinsurgency techniques and all that first. So these are the best and the brightest the U.S. military has to offer. And they get over there, they're not allowed to do anything themselves, and they keep seeing time after time after time ARVN screw up. Increasingly, the Americans are becoming, even though they're not supposed to, they're becoming increasingly involved in the fighting. Sometimes actually taking de facto command of units. Much of this is illustrated in January of 1963 at the Battle of Pop Bach. The American advisor was a guy named John Paul Vann, and he's legendary if you study the Vietnam War. They had found the location of a Viet Cong battalion near the village of Pop Bach along a canal, about 45 miles outside of Saigon. And Vann had planned the perfect trap. There was no way these guys could get away. Well, the next 2 days, as ARVN tried to execute his plan, it turned into an exercise of everything wrong with ARVN. Timid commanders, botched orders, failure to attack, you name it. What should have been a huge victory turned out to be a dismal defeat. But the United States government and the South Vietnamese government proclaim Pop Bach a huge victory and hand out medals to the victors. To show you the increasing frustration of the American advisors, Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, in his after-action report, sends a copy directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You're not supposed to do these things. But in his own words, and I'll leave you with this, Pop Bach was, quote, a miserable fucking performance the way it always is, end quote. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday.